My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you all here. Before we get started on things about today's talk, next Monday is Veterans Day, so we won't have a talk. The following week, there's something going by which is, we call them lightning talks. It's kind of a sustainapalooza. There'll be 8 talks by both undergraduates and graduate students on everything from fisheries, climate change, land use effects on water, tribal communities, food systems, and tidal energy. So if you want to find out everything you need to know about everything, you want to be here for that. Just to comment about today's talk, our speaker, who I'll introduce in a second, has graciously agreed to meet with students afterwards from 4 to 5. So feel free. Some students are already going to join us, and you're certainly welcome to do so. So hang around afterwards, and we're just going to go down the hall to the right into room 105. So about, 9 years ago, we got one of our first big grants from the National Science Foundation that launched something called the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, and a bunch of faculty like Chris Cronin and Mac Hunter were key parts of all of that. And about a year later, it allowed us to bring on a wonderful cohort of graduate students. A big cohort, over 20 PhD students, I think, by the time we were all done. They were unusual. They had a lot of experience, sometimes from things like working in the Peace Corps or working on sustainability issues right here in New England for long periods of time. They even, if you wait for it to come around, they even wrote a paper, some of the students, about their experiences learning how to do the work that they then headed off to do themselves. This is that paper there, and this is a pretty amazing collection of students of the 20 plus. Up there, in addition to Spencer, who I'm about to introduce, you have people like Vanessa Levesque, who's the assistant director of the dual sustainability program, dual degree program at the University of New Hampshire, Karen Bielik, who's been at Dartmouth for a number of years, Michelle Johnson, who's at the U.S. Forest Service in New York, Bridie McGreevy, who's on the faculty here, Stacia Dreyer, who's on the faculty at Arizona State, and Holly Smith, who was on the faculty at University of Rhode Island, now at the University of Oregon. So, but interestingly, even when they went into academic roles, and not all of them did that, very interested in how you link knowledge with action. So very much problem solvers, and I admire that greatly. So the lead author of that paper, Spencer Meyer, we're lucky, has come up to join us today and to talk. He's a senior conservationist at Highstead, which is this regional conservation organization that's in Connecticut, but they work throughout New England. While he was doing his PhD research here, he and Mac and others got involved, joined up with folks at the Harvard Forest, who were thinking about kind of a conservation vision for the New England landscape, and they produced multiple reports over the years with the title Wildlands and Woodlands. When he got his PhD, after he got his PhD here, Spencer then was a NatureNet Fellow, a very prestigious fellowship at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, linked to the Nature Conservancy. He's very involved in the Conservation Finance Network. He's an expert in partnerships, and you name it, from conservation organizations, industry, public agencies, landowners, and foundations. And I think he's going to talk today about some really innovative work on the Sebago watershed and the way we should think about ecosystem services there and ways to finance those to protect what turns out to be the drinking water supply for about 1/6 of the population of Maine. So again, if you find this interesting and you want to hang around afterwards and have an extended conversation, come down to room 105 and join us. But for now, please join me in welcoming Spencer.
All right. Thank you, David. It's really wonderful to be back here. I think it might have, the last time I spoke in this room might have been my dissertation defense. I'm not sure, but yeah, I've had a lot of fine memories of this room and this building, and indeed on campus. I first came to the University of Maine in 2002 to get a master's in forestry and work through something called the Cooperative Forestry Research Unit that Brian Roth directs now. And that was really my first introduction to kind of the big woods of Maine. I'd lived in Connecticut and New Hampshire and a little bit in Massachusetts before that. And that was really the beginning of a love affair with the Maine woods as they say. And so you'll see a theme throughout my work of still having a lot of interest in Maine, still doing a lot of work in Maine. I come up to southern Maine fairly regularly, but I don't get quite up this far anymore. Once you move to the deep south of Connecticut, it turns out you become from away very quickly again. But anyway, it's really fun to be back here on campus and see a lot of friendly faces. I'm going to talk about a bunch of different people's work today. So right up front, I want to say almost everything we do at Highstead, and I'll say more about that in a minute, is through partnership with our colleagues internally at Highstead. We've worked very closely with the Harvard Forest, with whom we have a long association, but also lots of other organizations throughout the region. And so I tried to cite things on slides in various ways, but please, if you have a question about where something comes from, let me know. I'm also, what I've come to learn is called a half-ademic. And so you'll see some, academic citations out of the papers that we publish, but you'll see a lot of very applied work too. And that's really central to our mission at Highstead Foundation. We're a family operating foundation founded in the early 1980s as an arboretum on about 150 acres in southwestern Connecticut. Really beautiful oak hickory landscape. And over time, for at least 10 to 15 years now, the Highstead Foundation has really blossomed into this regional conservation and stewardship organization. We're small in that we're about 9 full-time staff, but we're very large in that we work through lots of networks and partnerships, as you'll hear more about. So it's a really fun position to be in. Also, as I said, working through the Harvard Forest. So as we go through the presentation, I want you to be thinking about the broad set of benefits that are provided by forests and agriculture across our landscape. New England has this very rich history of forests and agriculture, and I want you to be thinking beyond the wildlife and plant species that we know are so critical to protect in our landscape in these ecosystems and biodiversity, in fact. In a lot of our work, those critical reasons why we protect the landscape are a given, and that's really central and really core parts of all the conservation work we do. But a big part of my role is trying to expand, broaden the umbrella of people interested in conservation, if you will. And so I won't talk a lot about species habitat, rare, threatened, endangered species, but know that those things are the underpinnings of a lot of the work we do. So let's think about the vast majority of benefits to society at large that come from the landscapes that we live and work in, whether it's the education of future leaders, understanding where our food comes from, whether it's working landscapes. This is a picture of what was the Old Town Mill with a dam. This is a very different landscape now. To the wild places that we go to sort of get away from it all and sort of be one with nature and with ourselves. And instead, also be thinking about, do we want our fields in the future to grow crops that we're going to eat, or do we want our fields to sprout houses, as is so often the case? So we're thinking about a very changing, a very dynamic landscape where people love to come to New England, people love to settle, and everyone needs to live somewhere. And so we're fundamentally talking about land use change and land use conflict and everything. And that brings me to this broad vision for the New England landscape, the wildlands and woodlands vision, which for all of New England was first published in 2010. Mac Hunter is one of the co-authors of this report as well. And then last fall, in fall of 17, we published this updated report, which took the vision that was largely focused on forest and agriculture and broadened it to really think more about the communities and the intersection between the communities in these landscapes and the landscapes themselves, from a natural resource and sort of continuum across the urban to rural gradient perspective. Leading this vision, and you'll see there's the report, but there's also the initiative that embodies the rest of the work I'm going to talk about. And this is really led by the Harvard Forest, the Highstead Foundation, and our close partners in the New England Forestry Foundation. That said, we have about 30 authors from the conservation and academic communities around the region that have their hand and their wisdom embedded in this work. Principally, really fundamental to this vision is the fact that we live sitting right now amongst a not just locally and regionally important resource, but indeed a globally important resource. Here's the North American forest, the density of forest, the percent forested, and we're sitting in a hotspot of those forests continentally. Within our region, New England's forests offset something on the order of 20% of the emissions that come from this region. And you can see we're one of the more heavily forested regions of the continent. And so this is a critical resource for the many reasons we're going to talk about. At the same time, New England has this heavily forested sort of rich history. As many of you probably know, there was a forest clearing, development of agriculture, and then starting around the 1880s, farm abandonment across much of New England and at least the southern two-thirds of Maine. And so there was this great decline and then rapid recovery of the forest cover of New England. But in the last couple of decades, we're beginning to see this decline in forest cover across the region and indeed in all New England states again. At the same time, the dotted line here is the growth in the population within the region, which is expected to continue to increase, particularly as New England likely becomes a climate refuge, a place of relatively calm conditions compared to elsewhere in our country. Here is the precipitous decline in agriculture since about 1930 across New England, where you went from just under 8 million acres of active farmland to just slightly over 2 million acres of active farmland. So you see these dramatic shifts over the last century or so in both forest cover and in agriculture. So today we're losing about 24,000 acres of forest every year across New England. Over the next 50 years, which is the length of the vision is the goal of the Wildlands and Woodlands vision, that's about twice the size of that amounts to about twice the size of Rhode Island of additional forest cover that'll be lost in the next 50 years. And as you can see, this is not just a southern New England problem, although it is predominant. It is worse there for sure. But you can see the stark red contrast where there's high development pressure today and expected in the future throughout the regions, including even in the area we're sitting right now. And what's at stake? Well, we mentioned those core underlying principles, but there's a lot of our ways of life that are at stake as well. Here's a picture of the White Pine Mill at Robbins Lumber. We have our traditional sporting and recreation opportunities, whether they're on wheels or in the woods hunting. We have here's a picture I believe this picture's from Common Ground Fair, many of you know. And these are things that we think of as, clearly identified with our New England way of life. And all these things are functions of the landscape around us. So essentially, the Wildlands and Woodlands vision calls for protecting permanently 70% of the region in forest in perpetuity. And so this wedge graph here shows... We have a laser on here? Yes. So the two colors of green are the forest, and the amount of forest that is protected, whereas this declining wedge here is forest that is not protected from development over time. And so the Wildlands and Woodlands envisions a world where 70%, that is most of which is in working forests of various sorts, and 10% of which, or 7% overall, is in forever wildlands, where nature is left to take its course. And so this 70% of the landscape in forest cover is really the foundational statement within the Wildlands and Woodlands vision. At the same time, it calls for an increase between 7 and 14% of agriculture, which the New England Food Vision says could feed, that amount of land could feed about half of New England with that amount of agricultural cover. But we also call for a doubling of the area in development. This is not an anti-development proposal or an anti-development vision, and that's really critical. This is not saying we shouldn't be developing. Absolutely, we're going to continue to develop our landscape. But what the vision calls for is by doing it in a very well thought out and planned manner, there's plenty of room to accommodate a double or more in development while also protecting our forests and ensuring we have a certain baseline of forests forever. There has been remarkable increases in the rate of land protection across New England in the last couple of decades. Since 1990, half of the land that has ever been conserved has happened just since 1990 in New England. 73% of the area is in conservation easements. This is predominantly privately owned land that is under conservation easement with land trusts and other conservation organizations that ensure that that land will not be developed or used for other uses that are excluded in conservation easements. So there's about 9.8 million acres of protected forest land here in the region, where the blue is the privately owned land with easements and the red is publicly owned land. Maybe you can see your favorite recreation hotspot on that map there. Importantly, half of all the land protected has been done in the last 20 years, since 1990. Half of that is in just a handful of large working forests, many of which are in Maine, but they also occur in Vermont and New Hampshire as well, and are really central to a lot of people's work here at the University of Maine. So here's the current status of all these protected lands across the state, where the green bar is how much has actually been protected. The dark gray bar is the proportion of all the 70% that could come from the different states within the region, given how much forest cover they have now. And the gray bar is what might be left after that wildlands and woodlands vision. Here is a more detailed look at the rate of land protection in New England. This is in a forthcoming paper I've been working on with a colleague. And what you can see is in the number of acres is very episodic at this big regional scale. And each one of those spikes represents one or more of these large working forest properties. So these are things on tens or even hundreds of thousands of acres in size that have occurred throughout northern New England. And you can see that this was happening over a roughly 10-year period, which had a lot to do with land ownership patterns that we can get into later if you're interested in. But if you look at the number of transactions that has occurred, it shows a different story. It shows a strong declining number of transactions over time. So while the rate of land protection over this 25-year period has been 4 times higher than any previous period in U.S. history, the number of transactions is actually declining. We'll get into more of that in a minute. So some of you will recognize this graph or version of it. I've shown in this room before. This came out of work Chris and some others and I did when I was here. This is the rate of land protection in northern New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. You can see these sharp increases. This is the effect of different innovations through time. So the difference between this period and this period is effectively the growth of the land trust movement that was really born out around 1980 or so. This acceleration in land protection really comes from these large working forest easements and the realization that we needed to protect those resources from development. And you can see the effect on future projections that each one of those innovations had. Now what the Harvard Forest has been doing, and this is led by my colleague Jonathan Thompson, in this New England-wide scenarios project is really fascinating. Many focus groups were brought together across the 6 New England states over about a 2-year period and defined these 4 scenarios of what the future could like. These are not predictions, but they're ranges of scenarios of possible outcomes, and then a 5th one that is the recent trends. And these are all parameterized by working with stakeholders in a project very similar in many ways to the one that led to the Maine Futures Mapper we did here in Maine. And in fact, Chris and I and our other colleagues went down and presented to the Harvard Forest team and shared a lot of our notes when this group was getting up to speed. And what you'll see in these animations is that those scenarios play out in very different ways across the landscape, both from a development of the forest, a conversion of forest perspective, but also from what parts of the region might end up in forest, protected forests. This work is about to be unveiled at a regional conservation partnership gathering that we, Highstead, host every year. We're going to have about 300 people gathered in Amherst, Massachusetts on November 15th. And there's going to be a whole day devoted to the outcome of this scenario process and a training in how to use the web mapping tool that has been developed with some of our partners over the last several months. And so the audience for that conference will be not just land trusts and community conservation groups, but this year we've brought together the land use planning community and brought a lot of sort of big thinkers and practitioners in the planning community from around New England. So let's talk about money for a few minutes. So I showed you that graph that showed that the rate of transactions of land protection is declining through time. Well, here's the graph of that same same time period, the latter part of the time period. And here is the 2 blues are the public funding available for doing land protection. The top blue is state programs. In Maine here we have the Land for Maine's Future program, which just so happens to be part of this decline in the last few years. But we also have federal funding that goes into land conservation programs. And then the green bar at the program is something we've just completed in the last few weeks. This was a survey and series of interviews we did with the largest foundations nationally that fund land conservation and environment more broadly to try to understand what their trends were. And we see something different. We see sharp decline post-2008 in the various public funding programs, particularly at the state level. And we see a decline when all these foundations' endowments collapsed after the 2008 financial crisis. But we also see a steady increase in that amount of money. As their endowments have recovered, so too has their giving to environment and conservation. One thing we've noticed, however, and we have a whole forthcoming report on this, is that less of this money is going to land conservation specifically. Less money is going into land trusts to buy or to put easements on property. And more of the foundation money in the environment or conservation space is going to things like community and economic development and the intersection of that with natural land cover and recreation. It's going into community health and the intersection with environment. It's going to climate change adaptation, a lot of which is policy or alternative energy kind of work, but less of which is really about land conservation. Nationally in the US, philanthropy for the environment is less than 3% of all the private philanthropic giving. These are individual private donations nationally. And most of that 3% actually goes to the animal welfare space. So we don't know exactly what it is, but something much less than 3% is really the category of philanthropy we're talking about. So this new field, this evolving field of conservation finance, is trying to find the middle ground between environmental, social, and economic benefits that can come from protecting landscapes, whether that's agriculture or forest lands. And so this conservation finance that I'm going to talk about for the next little bit is really trying to identify the sweet spot that often involves philanthropy, but it also involves private actual capital investments in land, whether that's timberland, agriculture, or communities. So I'm going to try to give you a survey of conservation finance and what I mean by that. And to do that, in the last year, we've taken a sort of scan of the New England conservation finance and also around the country to find programs that are most relevant to us. And these topics include things from forest carbon offsets, I'll talk a little more about, sales tax programs, which would have been embedded in that graph I showed you before, mitigation of various sorts, water quality, tourism, and all these different opportunities. I'm going to show you just a snapshot of a couple of those. There's a long-standing interest in conservation at the municipal scale. In fact, a lot of the public money for conservation happens through individual town-wide ballots. We have some towns in Maine that do that, but in other states, particularly Massachusetts, that's the norm. This happens at the town level. But there's this push-pull tension within towns for this fear of reducing the tax base. As you protect land and you don't develop land, the worry is that you get less in tax revenue. And there is a lot of research that's been done on this. Most of it's not recent, interestingly. There's sort of a dearth of recent advancements in this field. But we've done a survey of kind of everything that's been known over the last few decades about this. And there's a pretty strong case to be made for municipal investments in conservation for the long-term benefits. For example, if you for every dollar in tax revenue that residential land provides to a town, it costs about $1.10 or $1.15 in services. Think about schools and police and sewer and municipal waste removal and things like that. Protected lands, conversely, are about 35%. So for every dollar you get in tax revenue, even if it's a smaller amount of total dollars, you spend a lot less in services in the community. So there's a much more nuanced picture about this municipal tax / conservation argument that people have been thinking about for a long time, but there's a sort of lack of information broadly on this. And so we're trying to bring some of this to light. One really great example of how communities get this principle is the Community Preservation Act in Massachusetts, where there was a state policy adopted that allowed towns to choose for themselves whether individually they want to voluntarily increase their property tax by up to but no more than 3%. And this is caught on by wildfire, as you can see by the graph. Starting in 2002, there were 34 towns that said, sure, we'll try it. 2015, it was 156, and we're well over 160 now, including Boston, which just gave it the green light about a year and a half ago. This has provided $1.75 billion for land conservation in the state of Massachusetts. Now, admittedly, it's a very different place than Maine, but it can show that when towns understand the benefits to real estate valuations, to quality of life, to attracting jobs and people, they've made that decision to invest in their communities in that way. All right, I took this picture last time I was up here. This old log truck, this double-wide log truck was parked right near my old house in Hamden. I see a couple people that drive that same way every day as well and maybe saw it. And I thought that was kind of striking. Well, we all know timberland markets, wood products markets are cyclical in various ways. And when they're not looking so hot at times, more people start thinking about growing carbon. And here's the New England-wide map of above-ground carbon. This comes from long-term data at Woods Hole Research Center. And carbon is a bigger and bigger interest all the time. And it's not just something people are talking about. Real dollars are getting spent on carbon. So when we looked at the California carbon market, 2010 to 2016, the red bars represent $25 million that have actually been sold, that have been transacted in carbon offset projects in New England. It's mostly Maine and New Hampshire and a couple other small ones elsewhere, but it's predominantly Maine and New Hampshire where these have occurred. The blue bars is another $75 million, so 3 times as much, in projects that landowners have said, we're going to do this. We've begun the process of inventorying our land and going through the permitting process to do this. So these are projects that are on the books as likely, not necessary, but likely to happen. So that's $100 million in carbon offsets in just the first few years of this program. And that's just in the California market, which is the predominant market, compliance market anyway. Similarly, people are coming around to the idea that the tourism in their communities in itself, nature-based tourism, I should say, itself, are wise investments. So in Vermont, the Vermont Sustainable Jobs, right, this is not coming from a conservation group. This is coming from an organization whose job it is to figure out where more jobs are coming from, has been looking at the mountain bike tourism. There's this huge expanse in the Northeast Kingdom called Kingdom Trails. And the revenue coming from the mountain bike-related tourism, think about gas stations, hotels, camping, restaurants, bike shops, is 6 times the amount of money they're getting on a per acre basis. So over $1,000 an acre they're getting from the mountain bike tourism compared to the timber revenues. But they're still able to also get their timber revenues. So this is a sustainable ecotourism that is not impacting their ability to manage the woods. And of course we have in the Sugarloaf region of Maine, this is playing out also. Walmart invested $10 million in developing a trail system near its corporate headquarters because of the ability to attract talent to their corporate headquarters. So they are getting together from an economic and jobs perspective with the local mountain bike clubs and indeed forming mountain bike clubs to be able to do this. So this is an idea that is catching on in a lot of places. The connections between health and nature are very strong, and for a long time people have understood that we're all happier when we spend a little bit of time out in the fresh air. That's nothing new. But what in the last 5 or 10 years has become more clear is that there's economic benefits associated with that as well. When I was at Yale School of Forestry, I collaborated with someone in Yale School of Public Health who had done this community health survey to try to understand chronic heart-related diseases across this urban to rural gradient across 11 towns, from New Haven out across the Connecticut shoreline, very urban to very rural areas. And essentially people who lived in the survey, people who self-reported having lower cases of chronic diseases also reported higher access to parks, playgrounds, open space, and other recreation opportunities. So we superimposed on top of that data set economic study and found out that we had these reductions in these diseases, so hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, not quite obesity, and looked at all the people in that region that in fact do live within a 10-minute walk of park or open space asset. And when we do the economics work on that, what we find out is that in just this 11-town region on the coast of Connecticut, it's something on the order of $37 million in avoided healthcare costs. So these are healthcare costs that no one has to pay because some residents have lower rates of these chronic diseases. And this is true across socioeconomic classes. This is not just an urban versus rural or a rich versus poor thing. This is across this strong gradient. So there's something here. And so we've been going around and talking with, trying to get some meetings with insurance companies, but also talking with some folks in the hospital world and the medical care business who are really excited about this. And there's a growing network of people around the country who are also already acting on this. There's this Nature RX program that's unfolding in various cities. And so we've now done the economics to sort of make the case for this and build on that work. So this is something I'm personally really excited about. All right, what about jobs? Can conservation lead to more jobs? So Kate Sims at Amherst, an economist, and Jonathan Thompson, myself, and Christopher Nolte at Boston, and another one of our Harvard Forest colleagues, Josh, have been working for the last several months on this project, looking at the increased rate in land protection and whether it leads to more jobs or not. Our ultimate goal is to look at a whole host of socioeconomic factors, but we've started with jobs. So we did this econometric matching process, essentially, where we find towns that are like each other across the region in all kinds of other ways. We try to isolate the only difference is more conservation in those towns. And what we find is a very small, it's less than 0.1%, which is a very small percent, but we do see a positive signal in the number of people who have jobs in places with more conservation. So let me give you an example of that. For a town with about 20,000 people employed, an increase from 10 to 15%, which is a 50% increase, but in an acreage perspective is not insurmountable, would lead to 1.5% increase in the number of jobs, or about 300 people. So in a town of 20,000 people, towns that have 50% more land conservation conserved in their towns have about 300 more jobs on average. This is a very powerful statement to be able to talk about. And so we're really excited about this. This paper's in review now. And then we have some follow-up socioeconomic indicators we'll be using as well. And water. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about water. All of these things I've been talking about are the principles that we're approaching to expanding the vision, expanding the umbrella of actors that come to the conservation world to achieve the wildlands and woodlands vision. We're asking to accelerate the pace yet again of forest and agricultural conservation in New England. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that conservation is not just for the do-gooders. It's not just for the people that care about the rare plants or just care about recreation, but we need everyone that's benefiting from these places. Water is a common denominator. Anywhere you have lots of forests, water is the common denominator. So I've been working for a couple of years with this really wonderful partnership in the Sebago region of Maine I'll tell you more about. This is the first time I think we've publicly, in a presentation, shared our brand new logo, so that's very exciting. You know, when a partnership gets to the point where you go and you design a logo, like that's a critical milestone. It feels really good, so we're pretty excited about that. So we're developing what's called a water fund, and there are about 30 water funds around the world, and they all work a little differently, and they all come together for different reasons. Typically, they come together because you have a watershed that is either approaching some management crisis or has already passed that crisis, and the watershed needs to be restored in order to produce clean water or absorb storm water. You have an impacted watershed, an impaired watershed that needs to be restored, and you get all the beneficiaries, all the people that get their water or have vested interest in that watershed being improved together, and you get them to co-invest in improving that watershed. What makes the Sebago Clean Waters Water Fund different is that we have this very healthy watershed where there's roughly 100 years of clean water sitting in the Sebago Lake right now. It's a very healthy, very clean watershed. And it has a filtration avoidance waiver from the US EPA. Which means they don't have to pre-filter the water before it goes through the usual final treatment process. There's only about 50 of those in the country. Interestingly, Flood's Pond, not too far from here, is another one of those where Bangor gets its water from, and Orono, I think, used to get its water from there, but I don't think does anymore. So the concept with a water fund is that downstream beneficiaries, whoever's drinking the water, whether you're a large commercial operation or an individual citizen, have a mechanism that they can invest and put money back into protecting the watershed. Those funds are used by the communities where the water is actually produced to conserve or restore or whatever the watershed, and that in turn improves the drinking water quality and then benefits back to the original consumers. So the watershed, it's been a municipal water source since 1869. It serves 1/6 of the Maine population, has this filtration avoidance waiver, and it has capacity was 6.5 billion gallons in 2016. About 50% of that goes to residential users, and then 22% goes to this category of very large commercial users, which are breweries, a biotech firm, hospital. There's actually a couple of other water utilities that buy their water from this water utility and then sell it to their downstream users. And this is the partnership that has formed around this watershed. So most importantly, we have Portland Water District, Open Space Institute, Nature Conservancy, Highstead, Trust for Public Land, all regional or national or global in some case conservation groups. We have 2 local land trusts that actually do land protection projects throughout this watershed. By the way, this is about 280,000 acres, this watershed. And then the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, which brings stakeholders together primarily in the lower part of the watershed around water quality and works closely with EPA. So we're doing a lot of activities as we ramp up. We're doing conservation planning. We've done a series of interviews with large commercial water utilities, water users, to try to understand their current state of knowledge about where their water comes from and how that impacts their business line. We're working right now intensely on economic and business case. Adam is here, who is doing a lot of the work with us as a consultant on this project. We're very happy to be working with Adam and Aaron Strong as well. We're begun to work in the communities. There's lots of communities in the watershed. They don't all get their water from this watershed, interestingly. The water goes downstream and goes to Portland, but the communities in the watershed get their water, drinking water, from other surface waters, or in many cases, wells. So you have this disconnect from the producers to the consumers, where the producers have a different source where they get their water. That sets up some interesting discussions. And we've had some generous support from the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. Just this year is invested in the Water Fund, which sources some of the funding from the EPA and Natural Resource Conservation Service. We've been working with Allagash Brewing Company, which has been a really wonderful partner and is really excited about this from the sort of building this together for their brand, but also their commitment to one of their critical ingredients, of course. And we're also working with the state to think about how the use of state revolving funds, which I can say more about later. Essentially, these are loans that water utilities can get to improve their water systems. And we're working with other foundations and beginning to work with other businesses as well on this water fund. We've developed this online mapper tool that we're using just internally with our water fund, that once we've capitalized our fund, that we will use to allocate funding to projects. In the meantime, we're using this to source and identify projects in the watershed, and we're really excited that we're working two of our partners together are working right now on a flagship land protection project of over 1,000 acres that will bring together all the principles of the water fund. The basic concept of the water fund and why we think of it as investment is that you can think about the return on investment of all the different benefits you get from protecting a clean watershed. So you might have most of the return coming from the fact that you don't have to filter the water and have huge savings associated with that. So you get most of your return in water treatment savings alone. But then when you start adding in all the co-benefits like the carbon sequestration value, whether you're actually selling that carbon in an offset market, or whether you're just contributing to the region's emissions, like I mentioned earlier, or the biodiversity value, of course, and these health and well-being kinds of things like the recreation and the heart disease, other things I mentioned earlier. So this is really what we're focusing on now, making this business case from not just the water treatment, but the other components as well. And here's a figure from Adam and Aaron's work. They're using the Invest modeling system to try to look at the monetary value, the ecosystem service value of these different benefits. Many of these are focused on water quality, but you'll see air purification, recreation, habitat, that are all getting added up in these different sort of conservative, more and less conservative modeling estimates of what those are worth. Some of these you can actually monetize, like the carbon or the water quality, which the jury's out. We're testing whether you can monetize that or not. And then, of course, we know where these things are happening because of all the great modeling work, and so we can start to map those out and hone in on the most important places within the watershed. So here's the basic pitch, and these are draft numbers, so don't cite me too widely on these. Adam and Aaron are working on these, and we're refining them. But essentially, $1 invested in the watershed yields somewhere between $5 and $9 in net benefits. So right there, you have the whole sort of return on investment thesis. Specifically to water quality, if we go from 84% forested, which the watershed is now, down to about 76% forested, losing 8%, that could trigger a 40% increase in the sediment and nutrient pollution in the watershed. That right there is what would trigger reductions in water quality and potentially lead to the need for a water filtration plant. That could cost $150 million or possibly more, depending upon which estimates you use. That would cost the utility about $13 million a year in cost, between paying debt service on the loans they'd have to pay, to building the actual infrastructure and the ongoing maintenance and operations of that facility. That in turn could trigger an increase of 84% in the water utility rates, which if you look at the top 50 users that are getting their water from the utility now, that would be about $2.4 million a year. So you can think of the $2.4 million a year as the avoided cost that those water users are not having to pay because they have this healthy watershed. With that $2.4 million a year, that could protect, if you used all of it, and of course that's a big leap there, but that is something on the order of 2,000 acres per year that $2.4 million could cover the cost of. So our midterm goal is to essentially raise a $15 million water fund that we think could finance 25% of the cost of doing land protection goal within the watershed. I should say the Portland Water District has a goal of protecting 25% of the watershed. It's only 11% protected now. So to go from 11% to 25% costs a whole lot of money. This water fund would come up with 25% of the cost of that money. So this last bullet is not quite linear from the previous bullets. Apologies for that. And this is getting a bunch of attention. So last year, the Portland Water District, Laurel and Paul here from the Portland Water District, received Maine's most prestigious land conservation award from, this is Tim Glidden at the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, who gives out the SB award every year. And the Portland Water District was the first time it didn't go to a traditional conservationist, either an individual, and it was also novel that it went to an organization as opposed to an individual. And so this was really exciting for the Portland Water District, who is already contributing to land protection in the watershed. They will pay up to 25% of the cost of doing deals in the watershed, is recognized for their efforts as a conservationist, even though they're a water utility. All right, so I'm going to wrap up and just talk a little bit briefly about how important it is for us to work in networks. As I said, we're an outfit of 9 people at the Highstead Foundation. You can see a lot of work represented from the Harvard Forest and many of our partners throughout the region. So one of the most important networks to us is the Regional Conservation Partnership Network, RCP Network. There are about 40 regional conservation partnerships throughout New England, operating on all different scales, from groups of a handful of towns to 3 or 4 states at a slug, all working together to achieve common conservation visions. Each one of them has a vision for what their landscape looks like or could look like, and how they're going to work together as organizations, land trusts, municipal agencies, state and federal agencies, businesses in many cases, all working together. So there are 40 of those, and my colleague Bill Labick hosts and leads a network of all of those. That's the group that is putting on this conference I mentioned on November 15th in Amherst. That's a really invigorating meeting every year. We also have this emerging network called Alpine, Academics for Land Protection in New England. The New England University scene owns a lot of land. They educate a whole lot more students that are the future managers of that land and conservationists throughout the region. And they have even bigger still alumni networks of people who care about all these things we talked about. So for our Wildlands and Woodlands initiative, it's a strategy to connect and work through these academic partners around the region. I do a lot of my work with colleagues through the Conservation Finance Network, which is a national network of people thinking about this, and there's a big focus on private impact investment in conservation. That's an initiative that was born out of these conservation finance boot camps that Yale School of Forestry hosted for quite a few years, and it's now grown into this huge network. We have a list of about 6,000 professionals around the country that receive our journalism articles and in-depth research reports every month, and a lot of this content is generated through graduate students that we work with. And the Science Policy Exchange is another important organization that Kathy Fallon-Lambert has led, and really takes a lot of the academic research on air pollution and pests and these sorts of things and turns them into policy relevant works of art, really. That's a critical group as well. So here's a map of those 40 partnerships I mentioned. Sorry, I'll just hover over that for a minute. Sebago Clean Waters is effectively an RCP, but is not on the map. It sort of sits right about here. But you can see quite a few areas of the region are covered already. And then the Conservation Finance Network, one of our core products, is this website, and we've recently launched a toolkit of articles all about different conservation finance strategies and case studies from around the country to really put some of this stuff into bite-sized chunks that land trusts or other conservation groups will take advantage of. We're conservationfinancenetwork.org if you're interested. And I think I'll stop there and say thank you to all of you. I see a lot of friendly faces. It's really fun to be back here, and I'm looking forward to taking some questions, but also then speaking with students afterwards. So thank you. Back.
I'm curious how the wildlands and woodlands makes a distinction between forest protected, more or less totally,
Yeah.
forest where timber management is still allowed. I'm wondering how, I'm saying that from some of the audience wants for money. How does that play out in the context of forests that are being protected for watershed purposes?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So, first off, I should say there's a lot of water company owned land throughout New England. Some of it is legally protected, but a lot of it is not. But it's been considered historically protected land, and that's sort of a bit of a technical distinction that we discussed quite a bit in our group. So there were some splotches on that red and blue map earlier that would be unprotected water company land, but legally, but by virtue of who owns it, it's considered protected. But it isn't really, and so that's an important point. Many water utilities actively manage their land. They meet strict water quality guidelines and best practices, but others do not. There are other places that are fenced off and do not do any harvesting, and so it's really up to the community or the water utility and the people that they serve. So in the case of Portland Water District, they have purchased quite a few lots, particularly close to the shore. They will go and buy lots when they become available near the shore. The rest of their strategy, a lot of the rest of their strategy for the watershed is really about working through partners, as I described in the water fund. And they've been doing this for quite a few years now, I think almost maybe 10 years now, working with the local land trust and the watershed to go do what the land trusts do best. That is to work with the private landowners and protect their land. Many of those lands are managed actively for timber, many of them are not. Some of them are small individual holdings, and some of them are quite a bit larger. So the short answer is there's a whole array of activity, whether it's timbered or not. But the water district feels comfortable with that because they can do a lot of large-scale protection of the watershed. Yes?
So in your plan for the 90% to be woodlands and 10% to be wildlands, so it's only the wildlands that are in the general sense truly protected, because if the woodlands are able to be
Yeah.
used for other purposes?
Yeah, it begs the question, protected from what, right? And so I'm generally talking about land that is protected from development. So it's land that is not allowed to be converted to parking lots or houses or solar arrays in many cases, or other real land use conversions. Within the 70% of the landscape, 90% of that in the vision is these broad, well-managed lands, which certainly includes lots of forest management, lots of high-quality forest management, and all kinds of land uses. The 10% is really the portion that you could think of as, in some parlance, you could call forever wild. We don't particularly use that distinction, but places are left to grow on their own. And so if you have windstorms, so be it. The trees fall down and they regrow in the usual sort of ecosystem function kind of way. So they're both very much embodied in the vision.
So I have a question about, when I got here about 10 years ago, it seemed like Maine had, for its size, a really high fraction of land trusts compared to some states, like a lot of small land trusts that were very active in the space. I know you looked at a lot of that, but when you talk about these networks, what have you learned? Because you can sort of imagine that small land trusts, just like you've said, kind of can connect with landowners in really tailored, context-specific ways, but then creating a network of those might become more challenging the more there are and the more context there are. What have you learned, or what has anybody learned about what it takes to come up with a shared vision and leverage the capacities effectively? Because sometimes they could almost work at cross purposes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of challenge in articulating a vision that is broad enough to be inclusive and get lots of people in the tent, as I described, but not so inclusive that you lose your purpose, right? And so land trusts come in all different shapes and sizes and flavors, and some of them are adamant about generating revenue by timbering their own properties, and some are adamant about staying out of the woods. And the goal of the vision is to sort of articulate room for all those different ethos, if you will. And so, and I should say, we don't tend to work directly with individual land trusts, except in a few cases, but the regional conservation partnerships do. And those partnerships are all developing their own visions for that landscape in which they're working. Those visions themselves are inclusive of all their partners, just like ours in the Sebago is, for example. And so in the Sebago, ours would be inclusive of land trusts who do want to manage their property and those that don't. In the state of Maine, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, serves this just really remarkably important role of convening and helping along the landscape of land trusts. And so when you were talking about 10 years ago, there were over 100. At one point, I think there were about 110 land trusts in Maine. I think there's something like 86 or 7 land trusts now. Sometimes that happens through mergers for lots of good reasons, and other times it happens through attrition, as I understand it. There are about 350 land trusts in New England. And so you can see the only way to have any impact is to work through enabling and through shared networks. And so there are other organizations doing that network approach with land trusts, and we collaborate with them as well. Chris?
I'm just wondering, concerning that water fund, historically has the Portland Water District not allocated part of its budgets to watershed protection or expansion of protected lands?
Yeah, I don't have exact figures for you, and I certainly wouldn't speak for them, but my understanding is they do. They have always had a budget for managing the watershed. And I even saw some of their historical documents from a long, long time ago where they mentioned that. But that wasn't necessarily about acquiring land. It was about, at its coarsest level, it's about making sure no one's, burning down the woods in the watershed, and no one's using boats in the no human contact zone near the intakes on the lake. It's about water quality monitoring, which is all about watershed protection and stewardship. And so they, as I understand it, have always had a budget and continue to do those things. They first started getting involved in the land trust partnerships because a couple of the local land trusts, Loon Echo and Western Foothills, our 2 partners now, came to them and say, hey, what would you think about working on this together? And they thought about it, and they did a couple of projects, sort of off-the-cuff pilot kinds of projects, and it worked really well for both sides. And so that grew into a formal program maybe 5 years, I guess about 5 years ago, that they do have a budget now set aside for doing that specific thing, separate from all the other watershed management that they've done all along. And so Portland Water District is already doing all this voluntarily. We as a bigger partnership are now coming along and saying, let's do even more of that by building this fund, capitalizing this fund that can pay the next 25% of those projects. Yes?
For the health/nature aspect of it, it said, I'm assuming that was like a survey that was distributed. I'm wondering if, because it said if the people have access to nature, but I'm wondering if access is meant as use.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those health issues could also be attributed to availability of exercise.
Yeah.
So just because they have access to nature doesn't necessarily mean that they're out in it gaining those health benefits directly from the nature.
That's a really astute question. That's a really great question. So that's true. So the original survey, the original piece of the study was a survey. It simply asked self-reported, do you have access to? And so we don't know what people thought. Was that like a basketball court, or was that a 1,000-acre woodlot that's protected? We don't know. It's probably more likely the basketball court in the park down the road. But what we did, because we had that same question, we weren't really sure of it, is we went and we verified as much as we could that the same percentage of the citizens in those regions have access to what we consider parks and open space by doing the GIS analysis. So we had census data, and we know where all the protected areas are. So we could actually validate that roughly the same number of people that said they had access to do have access to. That still doesn't get to your main point about is it use or not. And so as we talk to people about how we're going to replicate the study, we need to do more about that. An important part of that is, what is the quality of the open space? If it's a park with brand new facilities, everyone uses it. If it's a park with broken glass all over the ground, people don't want to use it, and therefore they're not going to walk there, they're not going to gain the health benefits from it. So that certainly is a really important part of it. We've thought a lot about that. We don't have an answer in the economic context, but we have some ideas about how to address that next. So thank you for raising that.
know, there are very wealthy individuals that have, John Malone, the Buck family, that are
Yeah.
buying hundreds of thousands of acres of land.
Mhm.
Where do they fit into conservation finance? That's the question.
Yes, so that very question is, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about that question, discussing that question with lots of people. So my understanding is that from an investment thesis perspective, so if you have very wealthy families that are trying to transfer their money from one generation to another, or in some cases they want to transfer it a couple of generations down the road, and they're looking for tax advantage ways of transferring that wealth without paying a lot of taxes, to put it crudely. And so timberland and agriculture in some cases has turned out to be a pretty good way to do that because of the tax structures associated with different kinds of forest ownerships. And so it's become fairly common for these families to buy large blocks of forest land and manage them like more or less like other forestry companies would. And then the ownership of that company transfers to the next generation. And then the next generation might liquidate that company or not. We don't know because this is a relatively new thing, and we'll know in 10 or 15 or 20 years probably. But so far, a lot of these families, well, I shouldn't say a lot, some of them don't seem to feel the need to formally protect their land. They're not necessarily looking for the revenue that selling a conservation easement would generate in the way that a forest products company is trying to generate a return for its public investors might. They're more interested in the transfer of the ownership, and they're interested in future cash flows. What I mean by that is if you buy a relatively degraded forest, or any forest really, and you kind of sit on it for half a generation while you're waiting for the next generation to own it, you're accumulating timber value, right? And so in some cases, they're setting up this highly lucrative future situation where you're going to have a really good forest that you can manage sustainably and provide revenue all the time. So if next generation does want to keep it, it's going to be a cash cow for those. Now, there's nothing saying the next generation couldn't liquidate harvest these properties too, but we don't know because this is kind of a new thing. But so far, they don't all seem to want or need to protect their land. There are some exceptions to that, and some of these ownerships acquired land that was already protected, so they don't seem to be shy about the protected land, but they don't necessarily seem to want to protect the land either, is my understanding.
So I'm not surprised if there are lots of questions, but we're at time, so I'm going to stop here. I want to remind the students that if you have more questions, come join us in room 105 in a few minutes. But let's thank Spencer for a
Thank
wonderful
you.
talk.